Today, we're going to talk about a single number that has had a massive, and I mean massive impact on millions of lives, the IQ score. We're going to get into its really surprising and frankly pretty disturbing history. So let's just dive right in.
Think about that for a second. And that question really is at the heart of this whole story. Because the IQ test didn't start out as a tool to judge people. It started as a tool to support them. How it got from one to the other is a pretty wild and cautionary tale about how easily science can be misused.
So, where did it all begin? Well, you might be surprised. It wasn't in some lab where scientists were trying to rank everyone from genius to dunce. Nope. It started in the schools of early 20th century France, and it had a genuinely compassionate goal. I think this is the most surprising thing about the IQ test's origin. Back in 1905, these two psychologists, Alfred Binet and Théodore, they weren't trying to find France's smartest kids. They were doing the opposite. They were trying to find the children who were falling behind, the ones who were struggling, so that those kids could get the extra help and attention they needed. It was meant to be a diagnostic tool, plain and simple. Okay, but that brings up a huge question, right? How in the world do you measure something as big and abstract as intelligence? Well, Binet and Simon, they based their whole approach on a pretty specific theory that was floating around at the time. They were working with this idea of a G factor, which stands for general intelligence. The theory goes that all of our different cognitive skills, like verbal reasoning, memory, spatial skills, they all tap into this one single underlying intelligence. So their test was designed to get a reading on that core ability. And the way they calculated it? At first, it was actually pretty straightforward. They'd give a kid a series of age-appropriate tests, get a score for their mental age, divide that by their actual chronological age, and then multiply the result by 100. And voila! You get the intelligence quotient, or IQ, a really simple formula for an incredibly complex idea. Now, the scoring is a lot more complex today, but that number, 100, is still the magic number. It's not a grade, it's a benchmark. It just represents the statistical average for any given group of people. Most of us, about 68%, are going to score somewhere in that middle range, between 85 and 115. But this is where the story takes a really sharp, really troubling turn. Because this tool, which was designed to help kids, was about to be transformed into a tool for sorting people. And the consequences were devastating. And here's the fatal flaw in all of this. The entire test was built on this idea of general intelligence, but nobody could actually agree on what that meant. What is it, really? This ambiguity, this wiggle room, was a critical weakness. It left the door wide open for other people to come in and twist the test to fit their own agendas. And you can see this shift happen crystal clear during World War I. The US military adopted the test, but they weren't looking for soldiers who needed extra help. No way. They were using it to sort millions of recruits, deciding who was fit to serve and who was officer material. The entire purpose of the test had been flipped on its head. But going from helping to sorting, believe it or not, that was just the beginning. The test was about to get tangled up with a really dangerous pseudoscientific ideology that would turn it into a weapon. And that ideology? It was eugenics. This was the belief that you could improve human society by controlling who was allowed to have children. Eugenicists were convinced that things like intelligence were totally fixed at birth, inherited, and that you could basically breed these traits in or out of the population. And they jumped all over the military's IQ data. They took those results and used them to create this false hierarchy of races, arguing that some groups were just naturally smarter than others. Of course, they completely and probably deliberately ignored huge factors, like the fact that tons of these recruits were new immigrants who barely spoke English or came from poverty and had never set foot in a school. It was a terrible and biased misreading of the data. And this wasn't just some abstract academic idea. It led to horrifying policies. In 1924, the state of Virginia passed a law that allowed the government to forcibly sterilize people if they were deemed to have a low IQ, to prevent them from having children. And you might think, okay, but that was just one state. Nope, the U.S. Supreme Court actually upheld that law. The highest court in the land gave its official stamp of approval to this brutal policy, all fueled by the misuse of the IQ test. And this twisted logic, it reached its absolute most terrifying conclusion in Nazi Germany. The government there authorized the murder of children who were diagnosed as having a low IQ. It is the ultimate
devastating example of what happens when a scientific tool is weaponized by hatred.
Thankfully, after the unbelievable horrors of World War II, the world's and the scientific community started to wake up and seriously push back against these hateful ideas. Evidence started pouring in that this idea of a fixed, inherited intelligence was just wrong.
A huge piece of that evidence is something called the Flynn effect. Researchers started noticing this really bizarre and fascinating thing. As IQ tests got updated over the years, younger generations were consistently scoring higher on the old tests than the generations the tests were originally made for.
So what this means is that, by the standards of our grandparents, we're all technically geniuses. But this increase in scores was happening way too fast for it to be about genetics or evolution. The cause had to be environmental. Things like better nutrition, better healthcare, more access to education. It was proof that intelligence wasn't nearly as set in stone as the eugenicists wanted everyone to believe.
So, after all that, where are we now? What's the deal with the IQ test today? Well, thankfully, its role has become much narrower, much more specific, and a lot more responsible.
Modern IQ tests, which are way better at screening for cultural bias, are now used to do things like identify intellectual disabilities or help figure out what kind of support a student needs in school. It's almost like it's come full circle, back to Binet's original mission, to identify a need and provide help. And just as important, they are no longer used to diagnose things like schizophrenia.
Which really gets us to the modern and much healthier way of looking at an IQ score. The test is pretty good at what it's designed to do, measure a very specific set of skills, like reasoning and problem solving. But, and this is the crucial part, that is not the same thing as measuring a person's creativity, their ambition, their kindness, or their potential.
And that brings us to the final big question. The history of the IQ test is a powerful and pretty scary lesson in the dangers of trying to boil down all the complexity of a human being into a single number. It really forces us to ask, can one score ever truly define who we are?